Welcome back. It's been a long 6 months, but we're here with our first in-person event of the term. So please join me in welcoming Robert Rinder. Does yours work?
It does, yeah.
Marvellous.
Oh, what an absolute privilege of being here. I'm going to say something which might upset people, but it's like that lovely moment when somebody stops playing the bagpipes. Just to be genuinely amongst people. Thank you for organising this and for doing it safely and keeping us all very COVID aware. It's a genuine privilege to be here. I was saying the last time I was here was debating in the final of an intervarsity debating competition, because I was in the cool crowd at university 21 years ago. And as I say that, all I can say is I'm glad I'm sitting down. Gosh.
So I thought we'd start. I mean, you were a fresher back in Manchester in the 90s. We've got quite a lot of freshers in. What advice would you give our freshers?
This is where language ends and poetry begins. I have no words to commiserate with each and every one of the freshers about the sheer FOMO, well, it's a nuclear-powered FOMO horror of being a new student. I mean, I'm so mindful that young sixth form learners and then students come and ask me very often, write to me questions about becoming a prospective law student. And I'm always conscious, supremely conscious of the privilege I had when I was making my decisions. And first and foremost, amongst those privileges, at the apex of it, was that I was aware that I was going into a university where I wasn't going to be facing any debt, or very limited debt. So to pay for the dubious advantage, close to £10,000 just for your fees, then to find that you're missing out on perhaps the most important, I would argue the critical feature of what it means to be a student, to have the intellectual space to grow, to meet like-minded people. And by like-minded people, there's a critical profundity in that. For a lot of people that I found in university was the moment where they quite literally found their home, their safe space, their community, their intellectual and cultural family. It's very difficult to do when you're locked down with 6 people that you don't know, some of whom have got, well, the cultural range of airline salads. And thirdly, just because of the sheer joy of what it means to experiment and explore and to delight in the freedom of the heady wine of being young. I mean, the attraction of Cambridge is self-evident, but for many people, its attractions exist in a romantic idea of years of things like Brideshead, etc., only to discover that you're in some Hollywood hideous disaster movie. And so the chasm between your romantic expectation of all of that work and diving headfirst into the concrete reality, the chasm between those two things must be very difficult to manage, to say the very least. And one thing I'm very aware and proud of amongst young people that write to me and my godchildren, who I listen to, are all university age now, is how good and how psychologically literate and emotionally aware you are about looking after each other and yourselves. And also facing what you're each facing, knowing that it's okay to be vulnerable and having the language to communicate that with each other.
And on that note, how did you spend lockdown?
Well, I mean, it started, actually, I got COVID in March. And the reason I got COVID is I went to Namibia to do a walk for comic relief. And it's an odd thing, but I think it's often the case. You should always think about what profession somebody does, and then you can guarantee that in their own life, they're terrible at it, but they're good at it for other people. So very often, if you meet an interior designer, there's a good chance, there's an above-average possibility that they'll live in Baroque squalor. And as a lawyer, one of the things I don't do, I do it for other people. Just as for years when I prosecuted international fraud cases, I very quickly could open up or look at the financial landscape and tell you precisely where the fraud had taken place. But I never read my own small print. So I found myself involved in an ultramarathon in Namibia. And that all happened very quickly. We were supposed to go to Mongolia. And the idea was we were going to do the highest and coldest triathlon. It's going to hopefully be a world record-breaking attempt. And if you're warm enough, you can do that sort of thing. But they changed it last minute because of COVID, and I'd done all the training. And what I find, and there is undoubtedly a thin element of homophobia in this, is that from time to time, I'm conscripted into, or cast perhaps, into certain things, certain roles. Certain opportunities, because they think that I'm going to yelp like a highly strung poodle, or I'm going to behave precisely as stereotype demands. So before we went to Namibia, they put me in an ice bath, and they were waiting for their camp jazz-handed moment. But one of the things about years of being in the bar, of being a student, being a lawyer, being me, having the gift of having a grandfather that I had, is that nobody gets to determine my narrative, least of all somebody with the emotional range of somebody who produces television. So when they put me in the ice bath, rather than doing what they wanted, of course, I immediately asked for a cigarette and a glass of wine. They cancelled the trip to Namibia, and they moved it, to Mongolia, because they were worried China was going to shut Mongolia down. And Christian Guri Murphy had to present the news. I was obviously less of an urgent worry for the nation. But they then moved it to Namibia without mitigating the event in any way whatsoever. And it was one of the great gifts of an experience in my life. But I came back and got COVID, as did most of us that went on that trip. And it was pretty grim. Once I'd come through the other side, and it was an interesting lesson in trying to crowd out the white noise, especially back in March, as this slew of anxiety-driven information across the political landscape came in. And watching, learning, and listening how people would telephone you, partially curiously to wonder how you were, but also in a sort of rubbernecking, macabre way to determine whether they had the symptoms too. And once I was through it, I spent my time in lockdown writing. We couldn't make my show, and we can't for some time, my daytime program, answering as many legal questions as I could for people who eventually ended up in furlough. And the high point I've been talking about today was helping my friends who have got young children, years 4 to 6, so 9 to 11-year-olds, in order to give my friends some breathing space, most of whom were, especially my girlfriends, doing full-time jobs and being full-time parents and trying to be full-time teachers. And so by 7 o'clock, they were walking like zombies and very often quite literally on the floor. I gave them an hour's break. It started with one teaching Tudor history. Well, I say Tudor history. It was a journey from Bosworth to 1688, and I look around here, and most of you will know what that is. You'll be absolutely shocked how vapid and thick so many of my friends' parents, these children's parents, were. And I taught them monarchs or kings and queens from the end of Richard III to 1688 to music, and it was one of the great delights of my life, I have to say. And I spent the end of it struggling with my mental health, and in July feeling like a lot of people, like the walls were closing in, learning how best to manage that, finding tools and techniques to work with the anxiety I was feeling, and on the other side of it, as I said, starting doing free legal work, looking now at the extraordinary, and I use that word on purpose, fallout, the fact that we are all of us, at the thin edge of an economic, social, and potentially political catastrophe, the likes of which we haven't seen for potentially a century and then some. In the last few days, I've become an ambassador for shelter, being especially mindful that over 500,000 people last week found themselves in rental crisis. These were people that less than 7 or 8 months ago had they considered a sufficient financial and consequent emotional cushion to be safe in their homes. And they aren't now. For the lawyers amongst you, that meant that I've been looking at precedents that I thought had been consigned to the dustbin of history. That's what I've been doing in lockdown. And just as an NB to all of that, I know that you're all locked down, and if you're third years, perhaps that's a good thing. But what I would say to each and every one of you, regardless of whether you're doing law or not, that we, each and every one of us here, the privilege of being here, in the next 12 months and more, there's the capacity, capability, and demand for each and every one of you to volunteer and to be of assistance as advocates for people who will need each and every one of you. And I hope that you'll volunteer.
I want to turn to your show. You're a bit harsh, aren't you?
No. Harsh?
Do you ever feel you go too far, that the poor person that you've shredded with words won't ever be able to pick themselves back up off the floor?
Absolutely not, Joel. I tell the truth. And here's the thing. About the worst thing that you could say to me, where I never worry what people say to me. I worry what I think about them. I don't care what people say about me on social media who don't know me. The reason for that is because I was gifted the ultimate and perhaps the most articulate and important privilege of all, unconditional love of a family. But also in the early years of my career, barristers or prospective barristers out here will know there's a cab rank rule, which means you have absolutely no right whatsoever. And in fact, it is not just an ethical no-no, it is perhaps wholly offensive to the credo of what it means to be a lawyer in our country. You are not allowed to make any determination about the political views of the people you represent, which meant that as a gay Jewish man, sometimes I was quite literally conscripted, invited to represent members of the National Front. And on one occasion, and I shall trigger warning you because it's important, you know, I'm going to use this language, one particular family expressed to me how thrilled they were that I was there because all the solicitor ever did was send this particular family yids and queers. Now, you hear that today. Of course, my reaction was to want to say, awfully sorry, Mr. Smith, and to go, oy vey. But I withstood the need to do that. The lesson from it, which has been profoundly resonant, well, is resonant, but was important, I should say, for me, was that these were not happy humans, right? You know, these were people that sat up all night wearing muumuus and chain-smoking parliaments. Anybody, any human that has residual energy, currency to invest in hate on social media or wherever, that's where they spend their political currency, their lives. You can see that bank balance and the detritus that sits around it. And so, consequently, I never care what people say if they're mean on social media, except when people say that I'm harsh or mean or unkind. And the reason I pull you up is because I'm never unkind. Now, in the program, you may see only 15 minutes of the actual case, but the case can last an hour. And so you sometimes see the highlights. But yes, from time to time, if somebody has behaved in a stupid fashion, they get told that they've behaved in a stupid fashion. And most of the time, they know that they have too. But that's not the overriding or even the underlying mission of the space or of the program. So in any day, and I mean, we have some very funny cases. In any day, we might have two cases that on the face of them seem totally bonkers. Some of them are those two might be the most legally challenging. If there are any lawyers here, I'll come on to one in a second. But of the other six, it's not that at all. What it is, what it often is families and sometimes even entire communities of which these families come from, who are in crisis, who have found themselves in toxic breakdown because of a variety of things. Their inability to listen and hear one another because of debt, because of addiction, because of any number of factors. And most commonly, it's not the legal issue I'm determining. What I'm trying to do is provide them with a critical space where they're effectively conscripted to hear one another under rules. And that genuinely, Joel, can make all of the difference to their lives. And that matters to me. And it's interesting that you say sometimes you're harsh. My mum came to watch the programme once. And for my mum, all the plaudits in the world matter, of course. She's a Jewish mother. She's thrilled, you know. Like my grandmother, who's still alive. Frankly, Joel, I could turd on the floor and she'd say it was art. But my mum came to watch a case once. And, regardless of the years of human rights law or being in The Hague or whatever, all of which she's proud of, to be sure. But I once said to a woman something about her house, and my mum was really upset with me about that. And she corrected me. And on the second case I did, having come from doing international law, sometimes freezing assets of ex-prime ministers worth billions of dollars, case 2 on Judge Rinder, I made this mistake. And I should emphasize, we're really regulated by Ofcom. That means they can ask for a full transcript, as can the participants and litigants on the show. Now, what that means is, even though I have a producer in my ear, what she is able to do is say evidence is coming up, or to give me, if you like, narrative indicators of what the case involves. She's not allowed to say anything that's going to interfere or influence the judgment. It's very important. If you say it's real on telly in the UK, it must be. But sometimes, certainly the first case I did, she couldn't help herself. And again, this is the example that I talk about when I think about my London-based privilege. Case number 2 of Judge Rinder. I should say case number 1, a woman was suing her wedding photographer. And I thanked the woman for bringing her mother to court. That's not my mother, that's my sister. I mean, try clawing yourself out of that one. And it was case number 2. And Joel, I said something like this. Well, I said, this is a case worth £80. That's not a lot of money. This is 7 years ago or so now. I had a little cough in my ear. I should tell you, the boss of my show is from the Black Country. It's north of Birmingham. Brilliant woman. Do you want to rephrase that? You sound like a right posh dickhead. So I duly did. But you see, it taught me, and it was an unkind and a stupid thing to say. Just very quickly for the law students out there, can I have hands up? Is anybody a law student in here? Oh, good, great. So some of you will know, I get letters from law students. Some of the cases that on the face of them have that thin veneer of pantomime are honestly some of the most legally challenging cases that we deal with. I'll give you a quick example. We had a case involving a band who performed outside Manchester Station. They were called the Piccadilly Rats. And there's 5 of them. 3 who could play, and 2 of them who were street dancers. One of the street dancers was 86 years old. And the manager of the band was about 73. The 73-year-old enters the rest of the group in the Battle of the Bands in Manchester. This is serious stuff. So they enter the competition, and lo and behold, they can play their instruments. They get to the final, and it's between them and one other group. Now, the rest of the group, the 3, without telling the manager who's entered them into this competition, they're going to do a stunt because they think that's really going to get them over the edge and they're going to win the £5,000 prize, which shared amongst them is more money than they've ever seen as professional musicians. And so they persuade the 86-year-old to put on a lime green mankini. And they don't tell the manager that they're going to do this. So the manager comes out and does his, I'm going to say this, anybody that know the Happy Mondays, Bez, if that means anything to you, look on YouTube. He comes out and does his dancing. Then he met with this sort of tsunami of hysteria. Because what's happened is the 86-year-old street dancer, who now sadly has passed away, hadn't then, he put on the lime green mankini, only had a wardrobe malfunction. And so the part of the mankini, which I'd never heard of before, that was supposed to be covering his manhood, in fact ended up on his head. And he hadn't realized this was what was happening, and he exposed himself to the judges, and he was duly disqualified. Now, of course, I get letters or people on Twitter saying, oh, and you can feel the shrugging of the shoulders and the rolling of the eyes and the idea that this is the most absurd case you've ever heard of. But law students out there will know that's not a straightforward case. It's loss of opportunity. It's breach of contract. How do you assess the quantum on that, the value of the case? Do I need to get evidence from the judges as to whether they would have won? So even the cases that on the face of them seem like the most absurd or straightforward or stupid cases often are laced with layers of complexity.
I want to ask a slightly probing question about the show. As you said, a lot of the participants are coming from traumatic and fragmented relationships. Do you think that the level of publicity they receive by appearing on a television show is not warranted by the sensitive environments that they're coming from, if that makes sense?
It doesn't, Joel. But what I think you're trying to ask in a roundabout way is whether or not we're making exploitative television. And I think it's an important question, if that is the question that you're asking, and whether or not being on television could do more damage and even in some instances violence, I use that word on purpose, to the litigants on the show. And I'll give you a categorical answer, and the answer is no, for a variety of reasons. Two, most importantly. Firstly, before you get on to have your case heard, a case that's even the most straightforward can take 90 hours of due diligence, and that includes enormously careful considerations of somebody's mental state, of course. And secondly, I'm not in the business, as I say, of making anybody look stupid. And anybody, no sensitive, no fair-minded critic that saw a week's worth of Judge Rinder could ever come to any conclusion, other conclusion. I believe that. And that's perhaps, the reason why, having been and still a member of a very serious set of chambers, I haven't been eviscerated by my colleagues at the bar. Because at the heart of every dispute is, firstly, a very considered and, by law, accurate judgment that I have to give. And because what I'm doing is giving people a platform to tell their stories. If I ever was part of the choreography of making somebody less privileged than me look absurd, if there was ever a moment, Joel, where I shut the door behind me and thought to myself, what would be good for telly? Then your question wouldn't just have validity, but I'd need to go away and think. I never do that. We never do that. The community that make my program, and they're an extraordinary group. And I say this here, but one of the great delights about working amongst the producers of my show is that they represent a real broad range of backgrounds. And we've stopped, for example, applications from anybody who submits, let me put that in a different way. We no longer give any weight to university. People can submit their applications if they struggle with literacy, for example, on video, etc. We have a real a genuine diverse group of people in the room, which really does matter certainly in some instances in terms of the advice that I get, and also the diversity of people in the room who advise me that have power. That matters too. So if I have a case that's culturally sensitive about something I don't know, I will have somebody in the room that will inform me and has the power to tell me I'm talking rubbish. That's important. But in answer to your question, which is an important one, no, not ever, not once. I wouldn't be in the business of that, and I wouldn't do it, ever. It matters to me how people are treated. It matters to each and every one of us how people are treated. I deal in the law. Sometimes, of course, it's a television program, and it's a bit silly, but that's because somebody's brought on a goat who has eaten the contents of a woman's handbag. Sometimes it's because somebody is making a Shih Tzu awareness calendar and has decided to sue her friend because the other Shih Tzu didn't show up to the wedding that they had organized. And consequently, the other Shih Tzu was jilted and she spent £3,000. Now, Joel, there's nothing I can do about that, apart from sit back and, you know. But when it matters, and mattered, by the way, in those cases to them, but where there's any substantive issue at stake, I never shut the door behind me and wonder what I can get from this person that's going to make me look better or the ratings improved.
I want to turn to a different side of the programs you're producing. I think many people who watched your Who Do You Think You Are found it profoundly moving. You've got a new documentary series on the BBC coming out about the Holocaust. I'd be grateful if you could talk us through that and why that feels like the program you want to make personally.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I mean, one of the things I should say is, you know, for years I did challenging law, like still my best friends and colleagues who were involved in it, you know, who I spoke to my friend on the way up here. And she's came here and has 3 children and no doubt a brief tonight that's covered in baby sick as she has to go and appear in front of some snaggletooth Wycomist judge, working 100 hours a week to make an application, an emergency application, perhaps for a refugee from Syria, for example. And I'm mindful that because of my show, I've had privilege and gift after gift, you know, from learning how to dance, but to above all, having had that opportunity. And so, yeah, some of you, if you had the chance to see it, my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. And without question, the most profound and important influence in my life. You don't really think about that till somebody passes on and until you start doing work. I think sometimes you can think that you're motivated. I came to the bar really because I was good at debating and that's what people did. And I thought it was where my talents were, I suppose. And because it was enough about me, what do you think about me? But gradually, and I need to emphasize, this was at a time when pupillage was available and I had limited debt. I evolved into understanding that it was critical to me to stand between the individual and the state. And having had a grandfather who had quite literally survived and touched the face of tyranny, it mattered to me in a way that increasingly became more urgent and profound. And when he died in 2001, there were a lot of questions unanswered and unasked. And so one of the great gifts was to be given this opportunity, the gift of finding more about his family. And on that journey, on that program, I was certainly aware of the names of his 5 sisters and his brother and his parents, but they were just names on a page, and that was it. And again, watch the program, but there are a number of things that aren't on there. Perhaps above all else, it's the places. Some of you, if you're historians or people that just sort of walk around this city, one of the things that's so magical about it is that, you know, you think, if you think about perhaps being here or maybe the Tower of London, if you squint enough and you can crowd out the noise of the flight path on the way to Heathrow, you share in a human memory because the brick is imprinted with somebody's human narrative. So, you could think, if you could just stare enough at that brick, that was what Anne Boleyn would have seen on the way to her stake. And standing in the building where my grandfather was as a child and touching the wood hadn't changed, and the wallpaper and the bricks brimming with life and spirit. And then the moment that you would have seen where it turned out the local expert, his grandfather and my grandfather had been best friends. And they played together in that place. And he quite literally, with the power of words, his grandfather had kept an almanac, a little periodical about life in this town. And he's the only, or was the only living person with verbs, nouns, and consequent memories of these people that I'd known who were just names on a page. So Elimelech, my great-grandfather, was small in stature, but high in hopes darting about the place. And every noun, every verb was brimming with spirit. It reanimated them there. And so that was a gift. And one of the good news stories was that in telling that story, I was definitely the least well-known person in that group. People tuned in their droves. It had about 7 million viewers. Another good news story was that there wasn't a peep of anti-Semitism on social media. What there was this wave of curiosity and people wanting to have a discussion. And so from that, I went to the BBC along with Walter Wall and the filmmaker that made the Who Do You Think You Are, which won a BAFTA, the episode that I was part of. And we wanted to think of a way of re-engaging our country with the Shoah, with the Holocaust, and thinking about how we could curate it. And very quickly, our new program, which is called The Holocaust, My Family and Me, it's in 2 parts, comes out on the 9th and the 16th of November. Just got the date today, so do watch it. Is about 3 things, very quickly. The first one is, apart from my own story, what we have is second generation going back to find out things they want to know about. And each one of them is located in Western Europe. That matters to me very deeply and profoundly. We live at a time, perhaps more than ever, more acutely than ever, in complacency. And unless you've looked at the architecture, listened to the music, heard the poetry of Berlin in the mid-30s, you can't know or feel what it was like to live then. And the idea that each and every one of them, just like each and every one of you here, sitting here, thought complacent, that you were the shielded apotheosis, the apex of advance in art, in culture, because there were clubs in Shoreditch and dancing and music and all of those things that give you this strange cushion that we can't slip into depravity. And all you needed was the right economic, social and political decisions built against a backdrop of crisis to lead into the worst cruelty that humankind could ever envisage. That happened against a backdrop of modernity. So all of the stories are located apart from my own, in Germany, Holland, and France. That mattered. There's another element. Each story has an element of rescuing and courage. I think partly because all of us, when we see stories about the Holocaust or any challenge, want to imagine that we would be on the right side of history, and courage is an important thing. You can't, as Maya Angelou said, you can't express or practice any of the virtues consistently without courage. And lastly, and this is the most important perhaps part of the program we've made, to have a general and broader and more widely resonant discussion about trauma. And to broaden it out even from the Holocaust. We forget sometimes that our parents, our grandparents, all of our parents, were parented by people themselves who are damaged. Some people have experienced more damage than others. But there's a strange epiphany moment, and For some people, it happens when they're young. Sometimes they're carers of their parents. Some people in their lives, it doesn't happen ever at all. But there's that sort of weird moment, a bit like when you're a very young person and you see your teacher out of school for the first time, and you go, "You don't live in school land." When you psychologically and emotionally locate your parents as human beings, and you realize that they're the completion of all of the toxicities and complexities that their family fed into them. There's a great Philip Larkin poem, of course, that expresses it better than I can. But for many people, not just of the Holocaust, families who lived through Rwanda, families of new citizens and immigrants of our countries that have journeyed through pain across countries to be here in our country, in our communities. The survivors of Grenfell, for example. What does it mean to be parented by somebody that may have lost a whole family? How do you parent? How do you love? What does it mean after that? So that is part of the program as well. And it was an unbelievable gift to make it. I got to say Kaddish, the memorial prayer, which is an important thing for my mum. I went with her to Treblinka, and we stood on that ground with the last living eyewitness, last human being who survived. His name's Leon Ritz, 93 years old. He hadn't wanted to be there, then he'd heard my mum was coming and insisted. And as we were about to make Kaddish, as I say, in memorial prayer, it was part of my mum's journey. There's no closure. That's a very difficult word. It's a word I think we should all jettison. Leon reached towards my mum, who had my grandfather's siddur, his prayer book. And as I was about to say my family's name, he said, no, this is for all the living people of the world and for Kol Yisrael, for all the surviving Jews. And the other thing that I did was to tell another part of this story, which is, again, has broad resonance for what's happening now across the world, including in China, for example. But that's just one of a number of places. I went and interviewed a woman in Belarus. I'm a Russianist and love Russian literature and try to keep the language going. I'm not great at it, but I do my best. And my grandfather, who died of COVID in the summer, we went to follow his family's story into Belarus. And I went and sat in this woman's house as she described what had happened to this Jewish community who had lived there, chiefly women and children and old people, amongst them ancestors of mine. And it was a strange thing. I'm not sure if any of you are doing modern languages, but eventually some of you doing law or modern languages. If you've ever encountered simultaneous interpreters, it's a really odd thing because they can only do it for a certain period of time. It's a creative job, to be sure. I was talking about this the other night. But very often, they have to divorce themselves from the narrative that they're explaining. So we had a fixer who was there listening to this woman describe the scene she had seen and heard as an 11-year-old child. And she describes this thing, and I can understand what she's saying, and so can he, but he sort of numbly, dispassionately, objectively, just translating what's going on. She describes this horror, and she says, the mound, the mass grave, was moving for 2 days after the event had taken place. And then the program maker said to me, we're going to go to the Soviet memorial so you can say a few words, Joel. And I thought, well, Soviet memorial. Some of you will have studied this or will know about Soviet memorials. They are, to be kind to them, egalitarian. What that ostensibly means, in fact, what it does mean, not ostensibly, what it does mean is that there's no specific reference culturally to the people who are there. It's the death of Soviet citizens. That's the normal course and what I'd anticipated seeing. What in fact happened was I was taken to a place beside an insignificant road on an insignificant street in an insignificant town by an insignificant roundabout. And there, instead of a Soviet memorial, was from here to that door, a ring fence, little ring fence, and in the middle of it is 75 years on, topographically, physically, tangibly, precisely the mound, exactly as she had described. And my interpreter stopped interpreting, and I didn't think my Russian was any good, and I've still looked back at the rushes, and that means the day's filming, and I took over speaking to her. And it was the mound. And what's so strange about it, and I hope you watch the program, I'm being as, you know, I never bullshit. Well, apart from the time I did Strictly and said my whole life all I've ever wanted to do is to get to Blackpool. But apart from that, as I came back and stood at that mound, I've watched the program back now because I was part of giving feedback for the editing process. And I have no memory, Joel, of being there. What I do know is I found myself saying and meaning, this is not the only mound like this on the earth. There are tens of thousands of them. And there are some which are being dug even now as we sit here. It's a sobering thought. But I hope people watch the program. It was supposed to go out in April, but apparently it was too depressing for COVID, so what can I tell you?
I want to ask one final question. You spoke about complacency, and I was wondering, how do we shake humanity from the sleepy complacency we often fall into? You spoke about the searing injustices, the ongoing genocide in China. What do you think students at this university and beyond should do? What practical steps should they take to raise their voices and prevent more mounds being dug?
It's such a complex and long question. You can sit in political science classes, and I'm sure you've got people better equipped and more articulate than me. But there are three things off the top of my head. You framed that question in a very thoughtful way, and I don't know how to answer it, save to say this. Number one, you as students, whether you think you are or not, especially if you are cloaked in the Cambridge tapestry, it means to the world you present as privileged regardless of the struggle, and in many cases, boy, have you had a struggle to get here. That means you need to deploy your activism and your political capital and your elbows with care and with strategic mindfulness. That's a posh way of saying, choose your causes well. For too long, and I've gone to speak to LGBTQ student groups, I'm a proud, flag-waving, gay man. But let's think about the causes and let's think about how we use our voices and our activism and the muscle that we have. And it needs to be as broad as possible. That leads into point two, which is we need to include as many people as we possibly can. What we've got desperately bad at doing is learning to hear. That doesn't mean you agree. It doesn't mean sometimes that even the opinions that you hear are safe. But what we have to identify sometimes, and it's very difficult listening, is to get better at having human empathy to understand how and why somebody has come to the political conclusions that they have. And then thirdly, how do we become better advocates, all of us, to persuade people out of those positions? And what I'm increasingly persuaded by, sadly, but it's true, is that these days, our political views, our views often about global events in the world, aren't located anymore in the logical cortex of the brain, where we used to be able to sit, even in this chamber, and I came and debate. I think My debating partner and I even won a competition here once, where it could be an exchange, a challenging exchange to be sure, of ideas and thoughts. I'm not suggesting any of you who have come here to be members here think this. But it used to be the case that the deploying of facts, even if you disagreed, could be meaningfully considered in a way which would be, if you like, part of the mind that governed how we framed our logical thoughts. For a variety of reasons, chiefly but not exclusively because of social media and because of our desire, which I understand and hear, especially from members and friends amongst the trans communities, our desire to be safe and to ensure the safety of others. What we failed adequately to do is to understand for a lot of people, their political thoughts and global ideas of the world are located in the emotional cortex where one's identity is. So when you're having a conversation with somebody, I use the word attack, but just challenge an idea, very often now what you are met against, or what happens, is you're not having an argument where somebody is receiving it as an interesting point you're making, but as a very challenge to somebody's identity, your sense of safety and self, and I hear that. So how can we become better interlocutors? How can we persuade people of our causes? And the answer is to deploy good quality examples and to have the respect for one another, rather than shouting them down, to at least acknowledge, however challenging the argument is, that you've at least heard it. And then say, I hear what you say. I know I'm not going to persuade you by these 3 points. Make sure you've got your 3 points. But I'd just like to tell you a story. So, for example, very quickly, when I was talking the other week about people who experience violence in the trans communities, I was at an LGBTQ event, an awards event for Attitude magazine, and a trans woman who self-identifies as a trans woman got up to speak, and she said, I was met by 10 verbal attacks and 2 threats of violence in one day. My ears pricked up at that point. And I thought, oh, what was that? She said, yes, it was today on the tube on the way here. Now that's an example, a useful example, and one that matters.
Let's turn to the audience for some questions. I ask that you keep your masks on just because of distancing in the audience. We will begin with the gentleman in the back.
I'm going to repeat that question. What advice would I give to people at the criminal bar, despite all the challenges now with COVID and the rest of it? My position has changed. I'm going to say 3 things about that. Nothing draws generational privilege into sharper focus than my experience of the bar. Sure, I got a first, and I liked uni and all the rest of it, and I came from a traditional background, but it was 2 of us, there were 5 pupils that were taken on. Now, my chambers, I can't tell you the precise numbers, but it's something like, depends on the year, but 250 to 400, we take 1 or 2 a year. And by the way, amongst that group of applicants, there'll be 50, 60, 70,000 pounds worth of debt. So I have to be conscious of that before I give anybody else advice. That being said, despite all that, the answer is 3-fold. Number 1, if you've got the passion, you bloody well go and do it. And don't let any person, any other human being, determine or dictate or curate your narrative on your behalf. But point number 2, which is equal to that, is if you're going to be a criminal barrister, you've got to go into it with your eyes profound and your heart profoundly open. It is a job which is a calling now as legal aid disappears shamefully. And boy, is that frightening, by the way. And boy, is that going to lead to even more racism in our country. That means you've got to have a currency that means you get up every morning, and it doesn't have to be perfect all the time or make you delighted or laugh, but you have to be passionately imbued with a desire and thirst to want to do it. And thirdly, to remember that in the long term, it will pay off. In terms of practical advice, two things. Number one, try and get as much work experience as possible, and don't worry too much about law work experience. It's a problem. You know, one of the things that I often find is a difficult. We found this in chambers. We'd have all these wonderful, applicants with PhDs, etc. And that's wonderful. But you know, the great advocates of my generation, some of whom have fairly above average academic qualifications, many of whom didn't go to university at all. You didn't have to. And in our chambers, one of the things that we invite applicants to do who get through to the second round is they're given a bunch of papers and they have to open a case to a jury about a pub fight. And very often, that can be over-intellectualized. And so what happens? Somebody stands up and they've done some incredibly important things, even contributed to academic discussions and discourse about a variety of things. Perhaps they've done other things in other fields. That's all very well, but when they stand up and tell me that the vehicle has come to the public house, and I think, do you mean the car at the pub? When you're dealing with somebody and a whole family, that's a profound emotional crisis. I want to know that you can communicate with that person, that you've had the lived experience of knowing how to judge that situation. So this is difficult in COVID, but working in supermarkets and pubs and volunteering for charities is more important than doing as much, having as many, all of that legal hoo-ha on your CV. And just for the sheer exercise of it, and boy, are you in the right place here, debating. The reason that matters is because, frankly, what you're likely to do for your pupillage application and ultimately your interview in round 2 will be a clear mitigation or an opening or a bail application. And the type of skill set that you'll pick up here just by practicing it will, frankly, put you ahead of other people, because you've got 5 minutes to persuade a group of people. It needs to be structured and cleared and triaged. So that's my advice. Carry on.
Do we have some more questions? Yep.
That's a long, complicated question. I'm not going to go into the political. It's a very thoughtful question too.
Can we just repeat it for
I'm
the
going
live
to
stream?
do you mind if I just reframe it? I don't want to be like, you know, a benevolent school teacher in year 2. What I think you mean is, because it was a perfectly framed and thoughtful question. But in a nutshell, it's you're asking me is do I think that social status has an outcome in the justice system in general terms? You asked a much more specific question about the Home Secretary and her populist view. And I'm going to answer that very simply. The answer is yes. And in fact, it's difficult to know where to begin. There are lectures, eons on this, but let's just frame it what it is. Frame it as what it is. And why each and every one of you are about to become more important than you possibly know. There is no justice unless people have access to it. It's as simple as that. Now, the reality is, let's just take 3 cases very quickly. civil law, there is no more, or it's very, very, very difficult to get civil legal aid. Now, most people, it's very difficult to make the case. If you're a lawyer, why should you give money to lawyers? And the answer is until you need it. And what does that mean? It means for millions of our neighbors, people live within our communities, at arm's length from some of us, in arm's reach from hopefully most of you. It means that if they have a family dispute, if they end up facing, for example, eviction, they might take a year, get legal aid to deal with that emergency application. But that individual has got a full range of issues, all of which could be resolved more cheaply in the long run by one lawyer's letter, by one thoughtful letter, perhaps assisted by one of you, who isn't afraid of authority, who has the capacity and the intellectual capital to write and respond on behalf of somebody that hasn't had the privilege of that. Speak to anybody. Perhaps some of you have family or friends or brothers or sisters that might have had special education needs. Unbelievably difficult to persuade the local authority. And one increasingly, I increasingly am of the view that it's made as difficult as possible. And that's the reality for most people. There are endless examples of this. You know, you run a small business. Somebody defames you online. Let's think about those cases. You've got no access to justice. You can't defame anybody unless you're very rich. Only the rich have the privilege of reputation. What's the remedy for you? Who helps you in those situations? And that's just in civil law. In criminal law, it's more important than ever. I know how difficult it is to make the case. Why should criminals, those who are accused of the worst offenses, have a barrister, paid, by the way, certainly it used to be, you say things 3 times to a jury, they remember it. It used to be the case that they were paid at the commercial rate of the prosecution and a decent income. It's hard to make that case, right? It's very difficult. Until it happens to you or somebody else, perhaps. Or perhaps if we locate how important it is now, more than ever. You know, it's still the case that regardless of your background, you get access, if you're accused of a serious crime, a murder, for example, to a QC, leading counsel, and a junior. And insofar as possible, although it's harder than ever, the legal resources required to meet the prosecution case. And that's critical, not just because it's guaranteed by Article 6.2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, but because it's fair. And because it means that we confidently can say that we have a justice system where that individual was afforded a fair trial, justice was done. Without that, our democracy is meaningless. It isn't just this golden thread. It matters when you see it. Let's think about the converse situation in other parts of the world. Imagine every day, for example, you're a person of color who lives in a community in perhaps some part of the United States. You haven't committed the offense that you're charged with. You find yourself defended by a public defender 2 years out of law school with a massive caseload. That public defender, amongst other things, has the capacity and power to speak to the prosecutor, granted, on your behalf, and the prosecutor has de facto sentencing power. In other words, they can plea bargain with each other. Tell you what, the evidence isn't really great, but here's the deal. Your client's a person of color. He's not going to do well in front of this jury. Tell you what, why doesn't he go for a 6-year on a manslaughter instead of the life he'll get in front of the jury? This is commonplace. This is stuff. This isn't more challenging conversations that sure need to be had about subconscious bias. This is stuff we can all see every single day. Now, imagine that's your lived experience in your community where you personally know somebody who has gone to jail, has had their liberty taken away when they didn't do it. And the reason for that is because they didn't have access to justice. And then you look at the righteous violence, perhaps, that ensues as a result of that. And you stop. And you pause. And then you make the case as to why it's so important that in our country, people are afforded not just adequate defense, but they're properly resourced. And that's disappearing. And so, populist or not, it's essential that each and every one of us fight for it, that we are advocates for making the case of how important it is.
Do we have... Yes, over there.
The question is, how does diversity affect the atmosphere? You know, like many people, I've had the gift of evolving, learning about this issue. More than I could possibly articulate is the answer to that. Let me just give you 3 quick examples. One of the things we have to do, as you can imagine, is determine whether a case is authentic. So sometimes it'll be so-and-so is suing so-and-so because for £5,000 over a car. Now, we need to make sure the 2 parties in the case haven't concocted the proceedings to bring them to court for tell each other, you can imagine. Now, the people who are coming for that case to be heard have to have an immediate understanding of who to go to in order to do that due diligence. So, you know of this. One of the questions they might ask is, how would you go about doing that? Now, for some people, me included, if you'd asked me that question when I was a 21-year-old producer, I wouldn't have a bloody clue. But you ask a 19-year-old who's grown up in that community, and the answer is, oh, that's easy. Tell you what you do, you call grandma, and once you've spoken to grandma, you speak to auntie. Point number 2, I've had issues. This often surprises people because although I went to a state school, people say I sound like I'd be mugged by a Mitford, but I am my own special creation. But one of the things I love chamber music, which of course has depressingly is attached to a certain cultural class, and female grime artists, and often show up at the gigs, and it's often quite a response. But the reason I say that is diversity in my teams means that if I'm, for example, about to approach an issue that I know nothing about, it could be about a rap artist I know nothing about, it could be language that I'm about to deploy. I have somebody, for example, in that team that will be briefing me about it. Now, it's not enough to have diversity in that room. It's not enough just to have, for example, somebody of a different gender, a person of color in that room. They also have to have power and feel imbued with that power safely to tell me that I'm about to talk shit, for example. And thirdly, what it's given is it's lifted the entire conversation culturally, emotionally, in terms of the exchange of ideas, in terms of people learning from one another. And so it's just made the show better in every conceivable way. I think diversity commercially speaks for itself. The problem is it's not enough to have diversity. You have to have diversity with power. That really does matter. It's not enough to have statistics on a page and have young people representing a diverse group of people. That's all fine. But those individuals in that room have to have the safe capacity to speak up. Otherwise, it's meaningless.
Should we take one final question, if there is one? Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, with the colourful mask.
Loving that mask. Oh, random. How did I get into telly? Really random. You know, it's a bit, I talk about this a lot. Life can turn on a dime, either way. And actually, the reason I answered your question so passionately about needing the emotional capital to do the job is because in around 2015, I was depleted. And I'd lost the passion. And consequently, as it does, that has, when you feel depleted, that can have, if you're bankrupt, an ensuing psychological effect. And around that time, purely by happenstance, I'd been for a few years prosecuting a case on and off in the Turks and Caicos Islands. The case is still going on 10 years later. I'd never heard of the Turks and Caicos Islands, I must emphasize. The only reason I knew of it is because when I was a little boy, we used to have a very inappropriate program nowadays, certainly. But back then, I suppose people didn't think of it. And I was benignly, at 7 years old, I used to keep notes on who I wanted to win Miss World, you see. And I was always most influenced by their speeches. And there was Miss Turks and Caicos. That's the only reason I'd ever heard of it, when I went to an interview. And I found myself as one of the legal advisors to the special prosecutor after that island had been effectively taken back into direct control. It's one of the last pink bits of the UK, very controversial. And I was on and off there, and it was all very well for the first couple of months. Be careful what you wish for. Fabulous beach, all the rest of it. And then I found myself thinking, okay, I'm a bit bored now. So I started writing scripts. Most of my friends from university, you know, I had, again, the gift of choosing to go to Manchester at a time where people went to university, not so much for Oxbridgey things, could have taken a year off, in fact, could have gone to Oxford, for example, the following year, but it was Manchester in the 90s. It was amazing. So not like this. I can't articulate how sad I am for it. I mean, it was amazing. I ended up writing scripts for my out-of-work actor friends. Now, not all of my friends are out-of-work actor friends. Obviously, my best friend is super famous, but most of them are unemployed. So I wanted to bring back a program from the 1970s called Crown Court, which I don't think most people can remember. But it was a sort of daytime show where you'd see real cases with a real jury, but actors kind of playing the parts. And anyway, I wrote this thing along with this TV company, sort of friends of mine, and went to speak to this woman. And I'd never care who anybody is. You know, if they're interested, as long as they're honest with me. And she said to me, memorably, I think that's the worst thing I've ever read. And she gave it her sort of aggressively undivided indifference. Anyway, that made me laugh, and I liked her. So I started chatting about other things, didn't think very much. And then took another case, partly in Croydon, and then I was advising the government of Jersey, who at the time had the Joint Independent Care Inquiry. It was an inquiry into historical child abuse. And they were concerned and worried, understandably, that the inquiry wouldn't get all of the material from the government for obvious reasons. So they hand that job of disclosure, all of the relevant documents, to a sort of independent counsel, which was what I was doing. When this sort of woman got in touch and said, how's about doing Judge Rinder? And I thought, yeah, all right. I mean, I didn't trust a word anybody said who was in telly, largely because, well, there's no kind or polite way of saying so many of them just talk bollocks. And what I mean by that is you go to a television meeting, some of you will if you end up on television, and yes, there are some creative moments, but a lot of the time it's just people sitting around trying to divest themselves of culpability in the event that things go wrong, and trying to find a way politically to maneuver themselves into the glory in the event that the show is a hit. This woman was very different. But because she was in TV, I didn't believe a word she was saying, so I sort of nodded along and thought, all right. Flew from Jersey to Manchester, and there was my court. And honestly, I'd given it no thought. And as I told you earlier, the first case was a woman with a wedding photographer. Thank you for bringing your mother, that's my sister, etc. And she put it out in the death slot, as it's called, in August. years ago now, and it rained, and it captured the public's imagination. But like I say, series of completely random events. I didn't apply, I didn't especially want to be on telly, but now I have been. I mean, it's just gifted me like privilege after privilege. It's been great. There is no downside. And I know, like, in addition to doing your work in the morning and finding, you have to, like, get your slot in the library. Some of you will read, I hope, the Daily Mail column of shame and all the rest of it. But I've got absolutely no time whatsoever for people in the public eye or so-called celebrities that whinge on about how challenging it is that people want selfies. Of course, especially nowadays, people need to keep at safe arm's length. But I emphasize for anyone tweeting pre-COVID, especially in circumstances where nobody's invading your privacy with a young child or a family member, which is most of the time, everybody's just delightful and kind. And in my case, I always rather assume it's because they think I can arrest them or send them to prison. But the upside is you get to positively improve the chemistry of somebody's day by standing there and smiling or just showing up to work. I mean, what's not to like? And anybody that you hear complaining about it, you know, frankly, you should stop and think and don't tweet them, but certainly wonder why they don't get themselves a real job. So.
Robert Rinder, thank you very much.